What we are gonna do now is try to discuss, to workshop, to put some questions, and we got all the speakers now present in this room. So I will ask to the chairs of the session if they can reintroduce the speaker, and the actual speaker can just provide a thought, a summary, or something that prompt question to the rest of the virtual audience. Like I said last Monday, why the chair should summarize it if we got the speaker just presence. So I would start with the session that I chair, was the session, sorry, the breakout room of the session one. It was a pleasure to have Dr. Chris Perley with us. In fact, he was the one that introduced me to the Thoughtscapes almost 4 years ago when I joined Lincoln University. Fantastic talk, Chris. Really challenging, really provocative. I think we all need to think and reflect on what you were talking about. Would you like to say one provocative thought or a question, and then we go to chair of the session two?
Yeah, I think the main issue is the fact that objectivity is a myth. That we live within cultures first. It's actually agriculture, and if we don't understand that as the starting point, then we risk making monsters, making gulags. And the challenge is that we dig beneath and look at how we see the world and what purpose we apply to ourselves and that world. Fantastic,
Chris. Thanks so much. Chair number two, breakout session two. I think Anita is smiling, so it may be Anita.
Yeah, thanks. So the first session I chaired with Professor Friedhelm Taub talked to us about specialised or integrated systems in Northwest Europe. Do you want to, Friedhelm, do you want to give us a quick summary of what sort of was the take-home message of your talk? He is there. He may not be there, so I'll give a quick summary then. Yep. So basically, he talked to us about the use of integrating livestock and crop systems using sort of a 2-year cropping rotation, which involved, 2 years worth of sort of like a clover lay, I believe. So sort of slightly functional, diverse pasture, and then actually in Europe, so relying more on pastoral pasture, I guess, for milk production. And basically the end result was that farmers can actually maintain their production while having sort of less inputs, I guess, to the system, which would allow them to sort of meet the incoming government regulations regarding environmental impacts of agriculture and completely reduce their CO2 emissions and nitrate leaching as well, just using these sort of diverse mixtures, I guess. And yep, so the next session I chaired was for Dr. Matt Beck. Matt talked to us about designing functional animals, I guess. Do you want to give us a quick summary of the take-home message, Matt?
Sure. Hello all. So basically, producers are faced with, in this the climate that they're in today, they still have to make money and be profitable. And consumers, they're worried about things like animal welfare, environmental impacts, how healthy the products that they're consuming is. And then, so basically using design theory as a conceptual framework, we pose that increasing functional dietary diversity can address all of these concerns that the producer is facing and that society has.
Thank you very much, Matt. That's great. So I mentioned we in this short minutes we talked twice about functional diversity. So hopefully Kona, one of my other students, is around there, so she can make notes or provide her own definition of functional diversity. And I'm looking at Frederick Leroy here from a human point of view. And we've been talking lately about, you were talking about protein and whole foods and all of that, and what would it mean for functional diversity in a more expanded context, if you like. But so I'm going to use this chance before I go to Sandy to introduce the speakers and summarize the chair session breakout that she chaired. So I had the pleasure to introduce and to chair the session of Frederick Leroy. I met Frederick almost 4 years ago here in New Zealand, and I was really looking forward to meet him again here in New Zealand, but we are working together, and it's been a pleasure to think with you, Frederick. So go ahead and throw some thoughts and questions or ideas that you may have from your talk.
Thank you, Pablo. It's a pleasure for me as well, of course. I think in my talk, essentially, I've tried to summarize my views on the food systems dialogue and why I think it's sometimes going in the wrong direction. And I've tried to identify the three main reasons why the conversation sometimes becomes problematic. The one is you could say there are three clashes inside that conversation, three tensions. And the one is the top-down versus the bottom-up thinking. The second one is the corporate interventions versus the more grassroots community-based initiatives. And the third one is the clash between plants and animals as a binary division. I've tried to at least very briefly argue that the way we think about plants and animals is the result of a historical process. It's something that is the result of cultural transformations, and human-animal interactions are at the heart of those transitions. And the way we deal with, the way humans and animals interact have always been at that specific time. Changes have been at those specific windows of larger societal changes. And then I used the model of Maslow, the model of human needs, to try to prioritize certain interventions that are needed, and issue a warning against overconfidence in the rather technocratic, metric-based kind of models that we are just launching at complex adaptive systems, and how that can be potentially dangerous and unpredictable.
Thank you very much, Frederick. Fantastic. You go, Sandy.
I had the pleasure of chairing Jane Addison in the first session, who talked about the alignments and misalignments of values in pastoral drylands, and she used two case studies, one in Australia, one in Mongolia. Janie, she did this while wrangling the answer and question session while wrangling small child, which I think she did a stellar job with. Jane, you got some key points that you might want to discuss?
Yeah, thanks, Sandy. I guess picking up on Chris's earlier provocation or summary that we're dealing with cultures here when we're talking about agriculture, and not just the cultures and the values of pastoralists, but a whole range of different interest groups in those landscapes, in those social scapes and those thoughtscapes. So I guess my provocation that's not at all leading is how we might consider those different cultures, those different values and those different understandings of what meaningful livelihoods are across those different interest groups as we move forward, or as we push an agenda in the way that we may see those future landscapes to be, or those future thoughtscapes to be. So that's my provocation. Thanks, Sandy.
Great, thank you. And in the second session today, I chaired for David Swain, who was talking about fenceless farming, which kind of blew my mind a little bit, and about the technology and the people and how they all interrelate together. Dave, do you got some brief points that you want to make about your presentation?
Yeah, look, thanks for that, Sandy. And after a bit of an issue getting the talk up, we got there in the end. So thanks for your patience. Look, it's I think it's very, very, very interesting that we see ag tech now becoming a symbol of innovation, you know, across society, but particularly in agriculture. This technology, that's moving forward, and I think we can sort of see this digital democratization, if you like, of society, and there are a whole heap of opportunities. And in some ways, the cutting edge of that, I think, in livestock is technologies like virtual fencing. And we can get caught up very much in the technologies themselves, but I think we're sort of missing the point a little bit. And the point being that, you know, how do we move forward in terms of those technologies and not make mistakes that we've made in the past with technologies where we've gone down this specialization. So I think this is about thinking about these digital technologies as holistic systems, and thinking about the connections, not just between the farmer and the livestock, but also between the farmer, the livestock, and the consumer, and bringing together this complete, I guess, circular connection. And so the question, I guess, that the thoughtscape, if you like, looking forward, what would the landscape look like if we were to remove all fences, including our backyard fences? You know, we put a lot of emphasis on ownership and control and management, and fences are symbols of that ownership and control. The transparency and shared vision going forward are really critical. So I guess it's less about the technology, although we did talk about the technology, and it's more about what that looks like in terms of reshaping a democratized landscape.
Fantastic, Dave. That's great. Thank you very much, Sandy. So now the room is open, the door is open, the table is open for discussions, questions, and just one thing, you know, regarding to that fencing and technologies, and that sort of discussion came last Monday as well. And here we got Nicholas Taylor, and that he provided an excellent examples about how a fence can disrupt pastoralism. So I imagine that he may have some comments about that when we had discussions with literally reindeer herder Sarah there as well. So the questions are open now.
Thanks, Pablo. I'd just like to pick up on Dave's interesting points before about what, you know, what does a landscape look like? What do our backyards look like without this sort of fence, or the idea of a fence, and that general idea around technology and disruptors. And I would ask the question, technology for whom, for what? Who are we trying to serve? What interests are we trying to, I guess, serve through some of these interventions that we're working towards, particularly in the technological space. And I guess I would encourage us to think that through, because, you know, just to give a simple example, you know, they're now finding that the coding behind the advertisements that you see on the internet is based on things like your demographic profile. So in Australia, women are being shown ads online that have lower salary scales than men, because women tend to earn less than men. And so it ends up potentially perpetuating an inequity. So I would encourage us to think about some of these interventions, particularly technological ones, and think through, you know, serving who and to what end, to go where. Thank you.
Dave, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, look, I think, you know, this challenge going forward around, I guess it's the technologies, but it's the technologies as they underpin the data, and how that data is then used or exploited or manipulated to represent different end user needs. I can only comment in the context of research that we're involved with, where we're seeing this growing interest in, I guess, really understanding who owns data and how that data is then subsequently used in terms of ensuring that the stakeholders that might need to access that there is that transparency that shines through that. But I totally agree that, you know, there are challenges going forward, and we really need to address those challenges and think about those challenges. I gave in my talk the example of the introduction of Brahmins into Northern Australia and the history and how long it actually took for that technology to mature, and the sorts of important interactions that occurred through that process. But you get to this point where stakeholders start asking really detailed questions. And I think we're just at that point within agriculture where ag tech, the questions are being asked, and the questions are being asked in relation to what the data means. Social license to operate is going to be become more and more critical. So the quality of the data that sits behind that, the trust in that data will be an important driver. I don't think we're there yet, but I do agree it is certainly very, very important. I don't know if that really answers the question completely, but certainly I think, yeah, it's an important part of that conversation.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you very much, Dave. Is there any other comment?
Just a comment to the last speaker. When you concluded with the phrase social license to operate, operate what? Social license to operate the data system, or social license to operate pastoralism, to be a pastoralist?
Both.
Both. Oh, that's very interesting, because Sarah Katrina Alexanderson, the reindeer herder who spoke last week, expressed extraordinary skepticism to the imposition of the use of microchips for marking reindeer, for precisely the point you made: who owns the data? And Sami reindeer herders traditionally have been fiercely independent, and now there is a move to oblige them to chip their animals so that somebody else can follow the development of individual herds. And she expressed, first of all, huge distrust of the system. Who owns the data and what are they going to do with it, on the one hand? And on the other hand, she saw a direct attack on their own traditional cultural way of marking and identifying animals using ear cuts. So I hear what you say, and you express it with regard, I think, principally to cattle pastoralism, but I can see a very close parallel to what you said in traditional reindeer herding. Who owns the data and what are they going to do with it?
Yeah, look, I agree that they're challenging areas, and the conversations around how and where we progress in terms of the recognized ownership. I can give probably the best example. The National Livestock Identification System in Australia is a mandated traceability system where animals need to have tags, and when they move properties, we can track that animal movement. And there's I would argue, an implicit assumption that the government actually owns that data, and it's serving a greater good. Now, clearly, the government have an interest in that data. It protects market access. However, in reality, the producer actually owns that data. The problem is the mechanisms are not in place for them to recognize that ownership. So it's about a conversation, and it's about developing solutions that enable the owner of the data to realize that they've got that ownership and they've got that control, and to manage that system. Now, a lot of these systems have been built up over years, and assumptions get layered in there. So it is really about that conversation. I can't comment on other data ownerships in terms of livestock and traceability, etc. But I think the principles behind it about that conversation and working through that is critical to the whole process. I don't know if that really answers your question there, Nicholas, but yeah.
That's good comment. Is there any comment, suggestions, questions for the speakers? So we got them here now. So now is the time. Here we go, Lynn.
I just wanted to comment. I really got a lot out of the two presentations we had, and then also about a discussion about meat and environment and so on. And I've been thinking about it, and I think it's about not demonizing a food group. We can criticize methods of production of different kinds of food, but we shouldn't I mean, it's ridiculous to select one particular food group, except maybe sugar, and demonize it. So anyway, it was a thought that separating the food and what it means and its potential from the methods that are being used, good and bad now, is important to the discussion. Because there are bad methods being used for any kind of food production, as well as good ones.
Yeah, and that presents a whole challenge, right? Imagine, and we got Ina Pinkster here in the audience as well, that works directly with the dairy industry in New Zealand. I'm aware that Ina is working in, for example, animal welfare, and Bobby Calf here. I don't know if Ina would like to comment as well, but in reading one of Frederick's paper, he talked about the cutinization of animals and so on. So I'm trying to create discussion or dialogue there. So if Ina is there, I would like to make a comment on that and put it to the audience. Would be wonderful. But John's got some comment.
Well, I just want to follow up on what Lynn was saying. I've been in some producer meetings. I work in extension here in the U.S. and I get into these conversations where somebody wants to do organic, and half the audience is like aghast at that idea. And so you see these people sort of partition along ideas about how to do things. And so I try to ask the audience to think about, what's the end point and why are we worried so much about how we get there? And so in the context of multi-scapes, I mean, Lynn's comment comes back to me. In the context of multi-scapes, I've got multiple actors, I've got multiple people with multiple ideas about what is good on a landscape. And how do we, coming back to the multi-scape idea, how do we integrate those ideas, which may often diverge? And so it's a question, it's a comment, but I like the great thinkers in this group to tell me how we do that.
Thank you, John. I wish Ritodi was here with us today because he's working in the methodology about design for the pluriverse, where it's trying to converge and find convergence points about cultures, about system knowledge, and et cetera, rather than force a particular integration of knowledge and so on. So Ritodi is going to be here with us next Monday as well. I think he's in a different workshop now in Australia. So that's my take on that, John. I'm sure I didn't answer correctly.
Tune in next time is what you're saying, Pablo.
Yeah, Ina is there. So I like to point out people, and so it's fantastic to have you in here. So yeah.
Thank you, Pablo, and for the challenge to bring the bobby calf issue in here. Because just relating to the other discussions that were had today, the consumers are changing their requirements of how our products are being produced. And from a data collection point of view, I see that a lot of the pressure here, or the incentive to collect data, actually comes from the milk companies for our dairy sector. On the one hand, government is asking more and more data about environmental aspects, but it is actually the milk processors that require data to show their customers that the production systems are the way that our consumers expect them to be. So I do have a question also for Frederick, and in another discussion about indicators, because it is then really important to show how you're doing things. And that is why data is collected and shared, and we express things in numbers. But how do we express values if there are no numbers yet? There's this discussion that we're having around animal welfare as well. You keep going back to something that you can express in numbers, but it doesn't tell the story.
That's a very good, well, I'm gonna just let Frederick to get back to you, but just as a comment, we are running a lot of experiment with our team about animal well-being, right? We are not talking about health or welfare of the absence of. We are trying to think of the presence of, right? And we are struggling And I would like to, if Kona is brave enough to comment about that, just expressing animal feelings or whatever we perceive and things that are not numbers. But I'll leave it there. Go, Frederick. Yeah.
No, I don't really have the answers to that. I think it's a very good question indeed. I know that there are certain people that try to quantify animal welfare. I think that is useful approach, and it has its values, but it's not enough. You will never quantify the whole idea. You will always need something else, and the something else is, again, I would say, bring back the production system to the community. The community has to be integrated with the way we produce food. As long as that is not being done, as long as there's no confrontation, we will always run into trouble. As long as we have this curtain that separates how food is produced and how we consume it, it will never work. So you can try to quantify animal welfare criteria, and that can be done to a certain extent, but I think it's more useful in a technological setting where you really want to, maybe steer and improve and optimize your production system. There can be guides, but there will never be the system that can close the gap between the public and the food suppliers, because something else is needed. And the something else that is needed is more, I would say, and I don't like to use the word maybe, but I think it's more in the mythological space. It's more in the creation of a story and a sound interaction. And with sound interaction, I mean a community interaction. It's a rather vague answer, but I think I just want to express my thoughts on this by saying that the metrics alone will never be able to capture that.
That's good. Hopefully, yeah, fantastic, Frederick. Hopefully, we got Fred Provenza to talk about that. At least in the last event, he's having problems with internet. We put a paper together that deal with this.
If I can chip in and direct reply to Ina, you posed the question: how do you get your stories out to the consumers? To me, it's really interesting working in the organics and the regen space. These small producers using social media, and they're directly telling their stories to their consumers. And they've almost changed the paradigm. They're not selling their meat or their vegetables, they're selling their story, and their customers buy their story and some product with it. So I think there's some really quite interesting stuff going on in that space. I think it's difficult as a big industry like Fonterra to try and get a story across. You're a corporate, you're just not authentic. It kind of comes with the territory. But for those, individual producers to be able to go out and say, this is me, this is my family, this is my farm, this is how I do stuff, these are my values. People, that gets across the story very strongly.
Just referring to Ina's question again, this whole idea about quantifying or, what do we do with values and things. And there's two converging sets of ideas. The first is Pierre Bourdieu refers to habitus, things we do. So it's ingrained within us. So our culture is something like certain cultures don't eat dog, other cultures do. There's no thinking about it. It just is the way it is. So that's not a quantity issue. The second thing is that if you look at other worldviews, and I think there's some really strongly emerging challenges to utilitarianism and to the idea that everything's a number, that's coming from ecofeminists on one side. So Carolyn Merchant referred to the loss of the divine, the loss of relationship because it's Cartesian splitting away and dualisms. And there's also ecofeminists. Ecofeminists in her one example. Freya Matthews from Australia is another. Val Plumwood, who is another Australian brilliant eco-feminine philosopher, dead unfortunately. And the other side of that debate is also coming from Indigenous thought, and there's a lot of that emerging. So that's like, hang on, your Western modern relationships that are completely outside our habitus, outside how we see the world. And you're seeing, for instance, in New Zealand, there's Te Ao Māori, which is the Māori worldview, and there was a soil and water conference like 2019 where it was agreed to bring this framing in to land care research in terms of because that was acknowledged as being the culture with that ought to underpin some of the science that we did. And it's really interesting when you talk about, like, if you look at the principles of Te Ao Māori, one of them is Kaitahitanga, oneness. So the idea that you're separate is complete rubbish. So that's a qualitative, well, that's a cultural idea for a start. The other one's whanaungatanga, which is like treat people as family and have manaakitanga, always be welcoming and things like that. So these are principles and duties and obligations and virtues that are enshrined within a culture. And we try to sit there and put utility numbers on it, which destroys the complexity and the wisdom that lies within the other ones that I love from a New Zealand Te Ao Māori point of view is a thing called Kaitahitanga, which is your kaitiaki, which means we interpret it as guardian, which is not. It's actually a reciprocal relationship. It's like you have duties and obligations to Papa Tuanuku, Mother Earth, and she in turn has duties and relationships to you. So it's a reciprocal worldview. Now, I think there is an absolute goldmine of deep thought within both ecofeminine philosophy and also Indigenous philosophy, and there isn't a number in sight. And it's a real question about who we are and what our relationships are and what our purpose ought to be given those sort of things. And I think that's where the solution is. It doesn't lie within data. Thank you.
That's a great comment, Chris. I must say that we are going to have in the next coming Mondays, Professor Hirani Matunga to talk about Indigenous scapes. And I'm very sure he'll be addressing some of these thoughts as well. So
I'll just say, Pablo, that it's when we say Indigenous, it's interesting to me that and we're vastly European, look at the people. The fact is that we also, like Anglo-Saxon, Celt, Germanic, whatever, there's cultures, Romance, there's cultures, deep cultures within the European system, which pre-modernity was steeped in these same ideas. We have Mother Earth, we have May Day festivals, and all, that was all very much part, Easter, that was very much part of the relationships that all Europeans held as well. I think we tend to think Indigenous is over in this camp, and it's not. It's actually part of the soul of what we are as well, as if I speak as a European.
Very good comment there. Yeah. Is there any other comment or any suggestion, any provocation to the speakers, if you like?
Yes, I just listened to what Chris had to say and I thought, gosh, that sounds familiar. As a Western idea, we have the concept of animal welfare, and who would deny animal welfare? Well, there is a concept that has badly backfired in traditional reindeer herding, because in Norwegian law, if you own an animal, you are obliged to ensure that it has adequate water, adequate food, and it is safe. And if you have reindeer free ranging in the mountains, which they do, you have no control of the water supply, you have no control on the food supply, and you have no control on safety. So reindeer are attacked by a suite of predators and killed. Reindeer are caught in avalanches and die. In bad snow conditions in winter, they starve to death. And quite recently, the animal welfare lobby actually used Norwegian law to call on abandoning reindeer husbandry, saying you guys are breaking the law. So where animal welfare becomes paramount, you are actually criminalizing an entire industry, because you are introducing a Western value into a system for which it wasn't possibly designed.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Nick. Any comment to Nick's comment?
So Nick, I think on that, there's the whole thought of animals being in a positive welfare state whenever they're managed by humans. But I think a lot of people would view wild animals, free ranging, that have, are able to make choices and, display their individuality. Many people would think that they actually have better welfare than animals that are, in confinement or even in managed pastures or in extensive rangelands or what have you. So I find that very interesting, that your comment that you just made.
What about cattle ranching in the US? That must surely be a close parallel to reindeer herding. Cattle that are ranched are exposed to predation and they're exposed to starvation. Is that an issue from the animal welfare point of view?
I don't think so. In fact, I feel like a lot of society would view that animal welfare is increased as you go from intensively managed, like confinement feeding, to intensively managed pasture, and then to extensively managed pastures. That's the perception I see from people. Yeah. So I found that very, very interesting.
Right,
Almost
so what you're saying
opposite
is
of
what
I
you're
would
saying then,
expect.
there's a one end of the scale, you've got a feedlot cattle who are safe and well fed, or energetically
Right.
well fed and watered. At the other end of the scale, you've got free ranging cattle or reindeer who are not necessarily adequately fed and are not necessarily safe, but on balance have better welfare.
That's good.
Yes, that's kind of my perception. Yeah, is what I've seen from hearing people talk. Yeah.
But I do want to say that the situation is not a good one in some sense. So I have always taken my classes out to ranches, and ranchers are now very, they just have to trust that you're not an animal rights or an animal welfare person, because they are attacked even though they have free-ranging livestock. I drove across the desert last week and saw branding in progress, where the people, they rope the cattle, the calves, and they brand them and they ear notch them. All of them are very traditional, like with the Sami reindeer herd, although a shorter period of time, but they're traditional. They're inherited from Southern European traditions, many of them. And they were just terribly afraid that we were animal rights people come to take pictures of them, doctoring a calf. So I had to convince them that indeed I am not that person. So it's not that it's not out there. It's just not usually focused on the cattle out on the range per se. It's focused on the handling of the cattle by people, because people are pretty bad actors in all of these systems with animals, apparently. Also, we have free-ranging feral animals, and they are protected by law, like wild horses. You're not allowed to let a wild horse go hungry or suffer in any way that you prevent, even though we have more of them now that we've taken off the range and are feeding than are actually out on the grasslands, because we have no feasible means of controlling their populations, because you're not allowed to sell them for slaughter. People have to adopt them. It costs a lot to keep a horse. It's pretty hard. So it's complicated. And I don't fully understand it, but it's complicated. The welfare of cattle out on the range itself doesn't seem to be a thing. But some other animals, yes.
We'll have Xavier Manteca next Monday talking about that. But Frederick, I was looking at you. I bet you have something to say.
I think that what Nick put before is very interesting, because it really shows this nature culture binary in the end, because it's talking about, on the one hand, nature having its go, and on the other hand, you have cultural control over everything, where you would like to smoothen out all the animal discomfort. Of course, you have the pastoralists, which are still somewhere in between. And the problem is that we're getting confused by this binary, especially in the West, so that it's becoming highly problematic on a conceptual scale. We have now animal rights activists, academics that argue for genetical engineering of predators so that they will become herbivores, or these are all kinds of very bizarre interventions in nature. So you would take away whatever we see as problematic, and by doing so, you even strengthen that binary. So it's this interplay between nature, culture all the time, and obviously, I think it's the most sound basis would be to find a sweet spot that harmonizes your cultural community within that gradient. And it's a matter of contextualizing the interactions between certain communities and the animals, and integrating it so that the community is at peace with it. And that's why we have to insist. And we'll always be trapped in this culture nature interplay that confuses us all the time. I think what Nick put forward is absolutely very interesting, because that's one of that comes out in many places under different forms and different shapes, but it always boils down to the same thing: it's the clash, it's this Cartesian approach as well, once more.
I wish that Ian Gordon was still on, because I reviewed his paper that he had submitted, and he had some case studies where they were looking at rewilding there in Europe. And I guess one area they had a drought or something, and so some animals were starving. And I guess I don't remember in the paper if they had criminal charges to these people, but people were like throwing hay over the fence to try to feed these starving animals. But that kind of goes all against the whole rewilding concept, right?
Yes, Matt, I can say a bit more about that, because this happened in Oostvaardersplassen in the Netherlands, which is a rewilding area. And it's a huge dilemma there, because the people around it, and even farmers, want to feed these animals. They don't want to see them starve. But that keeps more animals alive than what the area can support. So you only get more problems. And already years ago, I suggested we might have to harvest animals and then actually eat really the wild animals there, but people don't want that either. So it's a really difficult position there.
I bet it is. And Shannon Davis was commenting last Monday about some of the data she collected in parks here in New Zealand, in Auckland, where we got literally sheep and some cattle close to or in towns, and how people react from whatever media they can grab on to comment on what's going on with that cute sheep. So yeah.
I think it's a huge limitation to what can be done, that the public cannot accept either animals dying via natural control or through harvest. I don't know what we're supposed to do, because large ungulates always, if there's not, well, I don't know even know if predators can really prevent it. They always increase in numbers in these preserve attempts. We have a national park that's got elk reproducing at a huge rate, and they're finally thinking, well, maybe we have to do birth control, which is expensive and difficult. So it's a limitation on what can be done, and a limitation to efforts to reintroduce wildlife in general, because once you do, you're going to have a problem on down the line.
And this is really also a problem for a lot of farmers who do want to tell the stories of their farms. They are doing things that the general public just don't understand and are totally against, because they think it is not right for the animals, for animal welfare. Here in New Zealand, the distance between the consumer and the producer is really large, because we export 95% of our products. So we can be really careful about what we communicate. But for example, in the Netherlands, the consumers are living right around the farms, and the farmers, they do get phone calls daily about things that people see that don't like. So it's telling a story, as what was said before, is perhaps a solution, but on the other hand, it can raise a lot more questions as well. So it's really difficult to try and find that balance.
It's part of our Thoughtscape, right? And how we deal with that, how we can invite to participate other people, other players in those systems in our Thoughtscape, or whether we consider them in our Thoughtscape. What are the boundaries of the systems? But Julia is telling me that, Nick, you want to comment?
Yes, we seem to come back to this issue of what the public understands, or more specifically, what the public doesn't understand. The public is obviously dreadful. We visited, myself and some Sami reindeer herders visited New Zealand about 20 years ago now, and we were amazed to see, or to be told, that you have to package venison, or cervina as it's now called, in a packet, but without a picture of the animal on. Now, what I've got out of this conversation is that free-ranging animals, animals living in nature unrestricted, have better animal welfare. So to me, it's entirely natural to put on your packet a picture of the animal in its natural environment, because this is the best you can do for it. And yet we were told exactly the opposite. No, you have to distance the product from the animal that produced it, which probably is very good marketing sense, but doesn't that perpetuate the level of ignorance? So meat is something that comes out of a packet. Meat is not something that was grown by an animal in an environment, which in the case of herded reindeer is their natural environment. So that was a sort of shocking inversion of what we thought was logically was appropriate.
Thank you, Nick. Any comments to Nick's comments? I think that really touched to your writings, right, Frederick?
I wrote something a while back about the Bambi fallacy. I put the blame on the fact that as children, the question I actually used to ask in classes, did you die when Bambi's mother died? Did you cry when Bambi's mother died? And because that's what, I mean, that was 1960s. So there's an inculcation of this cultural relationship with animals, that the only thing that killed animals in Bambi's forest were humans, loud crashing, guns and things like that. And animals, in fact, I think the bunny rabbit snuggled up to the wolverine or something. So
also petting zoos, their whole intention was to get people that grew up in cities to be closer to agriculture, but in fact it did kind of the opposite, right? It made them to where all they picture whenever they're eating this meat is this cute animal that they're allowed to walk up to and pet.
I think the views are somewhat dependent upon where your consumer audience is and the degree of disjunction between the urban consumers and people who are rural producers. That's within countries and across countries. I mean, we're relatively lucky in New Zealand that even though we're most of the population, about 80% is urbanised in large towns or cities, there still is, because of the very high export sector for agricultural products in New Zealand, there is still a good understanding of the fact that we're reliant on agricultural systems, and people have at least a vague system of agricultural systems operate, so that there's a degree of flexibility in concepts like animal welfare, where there doesn't seem to be such a large clash between the way that humans value, or our legislation values, wild animal welfare as distinct from, say, feedlot welfare. And I think there's a spectrum there that's quite easily explainable, and that's as you have increased human control over the animal's welfare or its living circumstances, there's increased human responsibility for it and an ethical and legal expectation that there will be more human intervention and care. And also, just another little example from New Zealand, where we have actually successfully, or do, and it's been running for a few decades now, the management of the Kaimanawa wild horses, where initially the idea was we would go in, because I was associated with this in my work, and we would actually keep the population within the ecological limits by shooting the animals from the air by helicopter. Luckily, wiser heads prevailed, partly from animal welfare and also PR point of view, and that wasn't done. And it shifted to annual round or biannual roundups, where, because there is still a large amount of land and people who are attached to land in New Zealand, there is a sufficient number of people to take the excess of the herd to keep it within ecological constraints. So, I mean, we're lucky in New Zealand here about these conversations. We have more flexibility than some other countries.
So what they found out in anthropology and also in psychology is that the killing of animals is just a very difficult moment for humans. So if you kill an animal, some anthropologists call it the dark event. It's just something very difficult to do. And it's possible if you really insert it into a worldview and then it's operational. It's always difficult, but if it's integrated in a cosmology, it works just fine. And that's what humans have been doing since the beginning. We have information from hunter-gatherers, and the way they approach killing is very interesting. It can either be indeed a transactional activity, you give something, but they ask forgiveness to the animals, so they don't treat it as something very purely transactional as well. It's rich. It's a ritualized moment, and that has been the model for most of our time on Earth. And it's what I mentioned in my talk about, you know, this transition from zoophage to sarcophage is when you step away from eating animals to eating meat as a commodity. It's a leap. It's a very important change in the way we approach food, and that's, I think, at the heart of the whole problem here. So and the way that is being done, or the extent that is being done, depends on your cultural context. It may be more pronounced in Anglo-Saxon countries than it is in many other countries. You even see within Europe that you have a very big difference between a country like Greece and compared to the UK, for instance, that there are important differences. It's about how this thing can be contextualized, and in the end, it boils down to the problems we have with death. There's, as Lynn said before as well, which just is the difficulty of confronting death in a Western society. There's a study on Italian vegetarians, for instance, and they try to figure out what's behind their reasoning, and what they bumped on was always the same thing. It was purity and death that were contaminating the meat. You see, it's contextual, it's contingent on the cultural background, and whether that will work or not, I think this, the package that has to come with all this is that it has to be harmonized with the culture you're living in, otherwise it will not work.
So just I would like to thank you all very much for your participation. It's been great today. I'd like to thank all the speakers. The ones that I chaired, they were fantastic. The rest, no, not at all. Just thank you very much. Thank you, Frederick. Thank you, Dave. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for your talk. Thank you, everybody, for your papers. Thank you.